Because of the geography, this area was the crossroads for many events important to Montana history. Following Lewis and Clark were fur traders, the steamboats, miners, cattlemen, merchants, the Great Northern Railway, and homesteaders. People had a lot of different reasons for coming west, and as a result, Montana has a history of boom and bust. The Winifred area shares in this history. Before the homesteaders, Lewis and Clark Corp of Discovery had come up the Missouri River in 1805 and traversed much of the Winifred area. They arrived at the mouth of the Judith River on May 19, 1805, and named it for Clark's sweetheart, Julia Hancock. At the time, the area was used by many Native American tribes: Blackfeet, Crow, Cheyenne, Plains Cree, Plains Chippewa, Dakota, and Nakota, to name a few. Following Lewis and Clark, trappers and fur traders created the first boom in Montana. With the fur trade industry, combat between U.S. military and Native American Indians defending their land became frequent. Dozens of forts were built throughout Montana to serve the fur industry and the military, some being located north of Winifred along the Missouri River and near the confluence of the Judith River. In 1843, Fort Codron was built opposite the mouth of the Judith River on the north bank of the Missouri. It was abandoned in 1874 when Fort Lewis was established on the present-day site of Lewistown. This new location proved to be better suited for trade with the Indians. In 1866, Camp Cook was established on the west bank of the Judith River and was the first military post to be built in Montana. Its primary purpose was to provide protection to river traffic and settlers. 39 steamers passed the mouth of the Judith River in 1867. Skirmishes with Indians often made life miserable for the troops. In 1869, Fort Claggett was established by T.C. Power, just 3/4 of a mile upstream from Camp Cook. It was built as a trading post to serve the soldiers at Camp Cook and for steamboat trade. However, the fort in this location proved to be short-lived, as Camp Cook closed in 1870. In 1872, Power moved Fort Claggett 1/4 of a mile below the mouth of the Judith River. In 1878, a large stone warehouse and trading post was built and named Judith Landing. In 1852, gold was discovered in Montana, and although none was discovered in the Winifred area, in 1880, gold was discovered at Kendall in the Moccasin Mountains and at Maiden in the Judith Mountains. Many miners and cowboys seeking their fortune traveled by steamboat to Judith Landing and took the Claggett Trail, climbing up the Missouri Breaks through the Winifred area on their way to the Judith and Moccasin Mountains. In 1866, Nelson Story drove approximately 1,000 head of Texas Longhorns to Montana along the Bozeman Trail, the first major cattle drive from Texas into Montana. First cattle drives were made as a way to supply beef to the gold fields, but soon came to take advantage of the last easily available source of vast stretches of grass. These first ranches operated on open range and consisted of thousands of head of cattle. The Winifred area saw several of these large ranches established. James Fergus, from whom Fergus County is named, first hit pay dirt near Bannock, Montana, and started his first ranch near Helena, Montana in 1865. In 1880, at 66, he was looking for a new frontier. James and his son Andrew were ranging a vast area, including the Dog Creek and Armel's drainages. They established a sheep camp at or near what is now the town of Winifred. By 1889, cow and sheep outfits were scattered all over the area. These included J.R. Norris at Fort Claggett, Jacob L. Jurdy at Winifred, William T. Swope east of Suffolk, and John Brooks west of Suffolk. Norris later joined with T.C. Power to form the PN Ranch. Overgrazing and harsh winters were factors that brought an end to the age of the open range. Due to the arid climate of Montana, sheep made up a major part of the livestock industry. Fergus had sheep as well as many of the other ranchers. Horses were raised in large numbers in Montana, as they were required for work, both cattle handling and as draft animals, and purchased by the government for the military. World War I was the last large use of horses for military purposes. As Montana was opened up to homesteading, and the open range was fenced with barbed wire, it saw the end of the boom of cattle barons. President Abraham Lincoln signed the first Homestead Act into law on May 20th, 1862, for the purpose of accelerating the settlement of the Western Territories. Anyone older than 21 was eligible for a homestead, provided they had never taken up arms against the United States government. This included women and liberated slaves as well. By this act, an adult citizen could claim 160 acres, a quarter section, of federal land. There were 3 steps to the process. The claimant had to file an application, improve the land, including farming and building a house, and lastly, file for deed of title. They had to spend 5 years on the land in order to become owners, and they needed to pay a small fee. The Winifred community was made up of a diverse group of immigrants: Russian, English, Iceland, Croatian, German, Native American, Scotland, and more. The avocation of the people coming west was diverse: lawyers, doctors, farmers, drifters, and some outlaws. Montana was the last of the great public land states, so when the homestead boom took place in the early 1900s, more people claimed more land in Montana than any other state. Between 1909 and 1923, settlers filed 114,620 homestead claims in Montana. The homestead boom ended almost as fast as it began. There was plenty of rain and good crops from 1909 through 1916. In spite of these good times, many homesteaders were already leaving. By 1917, drought was beginning to ravage the Great Plains. World War I ended and wheat prices fell. By 1919, the fields were blowing away with great dust storms. The Winifred community was caught up in this scourge. While some homesteaders were fortunate enough to locate on a good water source, many were not. Families had to haul their water considerable distances for all their needs. Hunting provided some of the only meat available. If you got on track of a deer, you stayed on it, sometimes 2 to 3 days, till the animal was brought down. By the end of the Depression, there was not a lot of wild game left in the area. Neighbors helped neighbors, but for many it was simply too much. Turning their stock loose to fend for themselves, they walked away. Some so quickly, they left dishes setting on the table. The lifestyle was full of hardships. Isolation was a huge factor. Sometimes the women of the family did not get to town in over a year. With rain, travel was impossible with anything other than a saddle horse. The demands on all were great. While the men worked in the fields from daylight to dark, the women were canning garden produce, sewing the clothes for the family, washing, ironing, scrubbing, and having babies. Children grew up fast, taking on responsibilities at an early age, working alongside dad or mom as soon as they were able. Housing was often primitive. The Homestead Act required you build a home on your land. While some built better log homes, many were tar paper shacks, 12 by 16 feet. Some of the homes were dugouts in the side of a hill with a sod roof. The coming of the Transcontinental Railroads to Montana Territory in 1880s is the single most transformational economic development in Montana history. Until railroads reached Montana Territory, it would remain remote and inaccessible, except to all but the hardest of people. Railroads are what opened up the state to homestead settlement. The railroads offered cheap fares in boxcars to encourage immigrants to move west. The homestead cars were divided into sections, one for livestock, one for equipment, and one for personal belongings and the family. While early settlers and many homesteaders arrived in the area before the railroad, the town of Winifred came into existence with the coming of the railroad. People first could get to Lewistown on the railroad and later Hilger. From these two stops, they often hired or rented horses and wagons to make the final leg of their journey, often in treacherous traveling conditions. In the spring, the area offered gumbo mud and swollen creeks to cross. The Milwaukee Railroad completed its branch line to Winifred, Montana in December 1913. The railroad was a great boon to the area as businesses sprang up. The Milwaukee Railroad made Winifred. When the town of Winifred was organized, application was made for a post office. James and Peter Stafford began building a store made of native stone. August 1, 1914, the brothers opened their store in Winifred, moving their stock over from Hilger. Theirs is the only stone building erected in Winifred and still stands today as the Winifred Grocery. According to our records, Winifred was named after the daughter of E.C. Sewall, an official of the Milwaukee Railroad, when it was constructed through Montana. Many other references and old-timers believe Winifred was named after Miss Winifred Rockefeller, daughter of Percy A. Rockefeller, a heavy stockholder of the Milwaukee Railroad. Miss Winifred Rockefeller is credited with designing the first Winifred Depot. It burned down in 1914. The first store in Winifred was a log cabin structure operated by Mr. Crow, about a half a mile north of town. Today's Winifred town site was in 1911 a large tract of land owned by Mr. Ike Palmer. The Milwaukee Company bought 57.4 acres from Mr. Palmer for the original town site. More parcels were added later. Ike was told by the company that people would be coming to Winifred and to build a hotel. In the meantime, he put up a large tent about a quarter mile south of town where people were fed and kept overnight. After the first train arrived in December 1913, more businesses were established. At its height, Winifred had a population of about 500 people, and a list of these businesses: 2 hotels, 2 banks, 2 blacksmith shops, 1 harness shop, 3 lumber yards, 2 garages, 3 hardware stores, 1 doctor, 1 optometrist, 2 livery barns, 1 jeweler, 1 confectionery, 1 Polian hall, 2 saloons, 2 restaurants, 2 barbershops, 1 shoe repair, 1 meat market, 1 dentist, 3 grain elevators, 1 real estate dealer, 2 lawyers, 1 justice of the peace, 1 clothing store, 1 bakery, 1 dray line, 1 laundry, 1 cigarette maker, as well as speakeasies. On July 4th, 5th, 6th in 1929, a great 4th of July celebration was held, including dancing, fireworks, baseball, a picnic with program, on address by a noted orator, with the main feature being a band of Indians from Fort Belt Camp in full costume with their own drums, bells, and other instruments. They carried an immense show tent, which was set up in the park. A crowd estimated at 1,500 attended, many coming from long distances. The baseball game was lost to Lewistown by a score of 10-9. There was a huge crowd in Willis Hall for the dance, which lasted all night. In 1938, during the Depression, a CCC camp was built on the north side of town. The first encampment was comprised of about 200 boys from the state of Illinois, bringing a small boom to the town. They built dams and corrals. They also developed springs in the area. The second encampment was mostly Montana boys. March 18, 1940, the camp burned. The water tower remained standing for many long years after. Electricity first came to Winifred through the efforts of Oscar Osbernson and his sons, Boots and Ossie. They set up, owned, and operated an electrical generator plant, Winifred Light Heat and Power Company, to supply power to the town. This operation was taken over by Fergus Electric Co-op in 1947. Beginning in 1953, the Osbernsons were also instrumental in getting water and sewage systems in the town of Winifred after 2 fires destroyed most of the downtown wood frame buildings. Education was a strong belief among the homesteaders, and they wanted their children to attend school. Many one-home schools were built and attended by kids within walking distance or horseback riding. Hiring a teacher in remote areas could be challenging. Finding someone with more education than the kids could be difficult, and then getting them to live far out in the country was questionable. Sometimes the schoolmarm wasn't any older than her oldest student. As roads improved and the population dwindled, the country schools began to close. Often those living farthest out purchased a house in town, moving in during the worst of winter, or perhaps the whole school year. Kids boarded with relatives or friends in town. Eventually, school bus routes were established, signaling the death of country schools. As country schools closed, the Winifred school system grew. It also had started out as a small one-room school. As the town grew, it became obvious more was needed. A second new high school of brick was built in 1937. This building is still part of the present school. The school was remodeled and more brick classrooms added in 1964. The old wooden school was eventually torn down after the new brick addition was built. The current shop building was built in 1974. The first kindergarten classes went to the first day of school in 1975. 2001, a new pitched roof was put over the school, as well as new windows installed. The most recent gym roof was added in 2010. During the 2013 calendar year, the enrollment K-12 was 94 students. Enrollment has fluctuated, being greater than that, but also less. Located in northern Fergus County, Winifred sits along Dog Creek at an elevation of 3,235 feet. As of the 2010 census, Winifred had a population of 208 people within the city limits, with 92 households. Being at the end of the road, so to speak, Winifred's population dropped dramatically after the homestead days. While the gumbo ground can be productive with proper amounts of rainfall, the area has always suffered from extended periods of drought. The 1980s were another particularly tough time for agriculture and low prices for wheat and cattle. Gradually, more farms and ranches have been consolidated into larger ones. Winifred is no different than many of the small eastern Montana towns in that it finds itself struggling for existence. Now, with the desire to live away from the fast lane, Winifred is growing slightly. Helping this trend along is Norman Osbernson, grandson of Oscar Osbernson Sr. Norman feels very strongly in giving back to the community that made him successful. He believes in paying forward to the next generation. He has pushed forward a number of projects in Winifred. The new community hall, which houses the post office, library, museum, fire trucks, a large hall for gathering, mid-state signs, a new motel complex. While Norman Osbernson is doing his part to promote growth in Winifred, there are an amazing number of locally owned enterprises in and around Winifred. Many are owned and or operated by descendants of the original homesteaders. These people and the surrounding farmers and ranchers make the Winifred community what it is today.